So I got thinking about the nature of Zen retreats because I was working on the schedule for our upcoming retreat. And how much do we sit? How much do we do other things? And so I think that, and I could be totally wrong about this because I haven't done retreats in other traditions. But I think one of the things about a Zen retreat is it's not just sitting. Now, is that because we don't have the capacity to just sit? I don't think so. The Zen retreat has many elements, sitting being probably the most prominent one, and maybe arguably the most important one. But there's also walking, there's also eating meals, there's also doing dishes, there's also sweeping floors, there's also taking naps. All of these elements are part of a Zen retreat traditionally, not just not just ours will be or treetops are or but that's part of the broader Zen tradition. And I was reflecting on that and on the blending of those elements and how much of each thing should we have. Um, and what came up for me is that, again, while sitting might be the most prominent feature, having all of those things is teaching us to integrate our Zen practice with our lives. And ideally, theoretically, and perhaps in practice for some of us, in a sense, there should be no distinction between that retreat and the rest of our lives. When we do our dishes at home, it should be practice. When we sweep our floors at home, it should be practice. Just as, I think we tend to think that that time on the cushions, well, that's the most important thing. And again, maybe it's the most important thing, but it's never the only thing. It's the predicate, it's the base, if you will, almost literally metaphorically, it should be the trunk of a tree that then spreads out everywhere in our lives so that we're practicing again with whether we're cleaning the toilet or cooking dinner or whatever it is, almost without, it should be without distinction. Back in the day at Zen Mountain Monastery, the stupidest thing you could ever say is, "Oh my God, I hope they don't give me toilet cleaning duty." Because if any of the monks heard that, you were going to be cleaning toilets for the rest of your life. But that said, um, but the concept supporting that was sound, right? We have many things that we do in our lives. Some we like, some we look forward to, some we hate, some we try to avoid. But Zen would say, no, we need to brace it all. We need to do it all with a quality of attention, with investment, not half heartedly, but wholeheartedly. And so I think that's one of the most important teachings of a Zen retreat. There's a whole mixture of things. Some we like. We might say, oh, I love to sit on the cushion because I go to this beautiful place and I feel really good. from Zen perspective, that is dangerous. That's an attachment. And so this retreat includes an assortment of things. Some you're going to love, some you might just, I don't care. Some you might say, why is Peter making us do this? But it's all practice. And it all needs to be embraced with that spirit in the same way that we should embrace everything in our life with that spirit. And that's not easy to do. We might all be sign up to cook a wonderful dinner, but not be quick to get in line to clean the toilet. And yet, it's all part of our lives. And that's just sort of a very literal, sort of quasi metaphorical thing for the whole thing, right? That's what our days consist of: things that we love, things we want to do, things that we hate, things that we fear, things that are painful and hurtful. And what Zen is trying to help us learn is to live fully with all of those things in each and every moment of our lives. Nanchuan said, "The great way is not difficult, only avoid picking and choosing," right? And yet, we constantly pick and choose. We constantly have preferences. This is better, this is worse, and so on and so forth. Now, that to a certain extent, that's okay, right? I mean, it's normal. Where it becomes detrimental is when it begins to shape our lives so that we are actively avoiding, that we are actively pushing away whole parts of our life, and we're actively pulling in others. One of the things that I know is clear to all of us, we have very, when whatever control we think we have over our lives is an illusion. The world we are experiencing is the world we are experiencing, and you know nothing that we can do can really alter that. So our job is to show up and to do the best we can. And that's why I believe the Zen retreat is structured the way that it is. The time on the cushion is not the supreme practice, it's the practice that helps us show up for everything else. It's that practice that helps cultivate the awareness of the ways in which we are picking and choosing, the ways in which we are pulling in and avoiding. And again, sometimes that, it's within a sort of practical range. We're always going to be doing that to a certain extent, right? It's natural. And when it's taken lightly and held lightly, it's rarely detrimental to our lives and our practice. It's a beautiful, beautiful fall day outside. This afternoon, I can either go for a hike or I could sweep my floor. I'm going to make a choice. I'm not going to tell you which one I'm going to choose. But in that instance, as long as I kind of hold the whole thing, like if then somebody called up and said, "Hey, Peter, can you come over because I don't know, I just fell and I need some help," and I say, "Oh God, now I can't go for my hike." Oh, I just gave away my secret, didn't I? Okay, so I said I can't go for my hike, and I was upset or angry or frustrated. That's where the problem would arise, right? Because I'd be clinging, I'd be grasping, instead of saying, "Okay, well, I have this preference. I'd rather than have a hike on a beautiful day." Or if there was, some other very critical thing that I was abandoning to do that. Okay, so it's a matter of sort of a matter of proportionality. But the other thing that happens at the retreat is it's kind of like we move through the schedule through the day. It's fixed. And again, we don't get a preference. I'm tired right now. I don't want to get up. Well, tough, you know. Um, or I'm hungry. Well, the meal isn't for another hour. Tough. We sort of have to live with what might be minor inconveniences. And that's the other thing that the retreat is teaching us. It's not designed around our comfort. If I'm here alone in my cabin and I want to go have a snack, I go have a snack, right? But in the context of retreat, no, well, the meal isn't for another half hour. I have to wait. And so it's teaching me to let go. It's teaching me to hold lightly. So many things. The very structure of the retreat is probably the greatest teacher that we have there. The nature of the variation that we experience across the day, across the schedule, is essential to our practice. If we just sit, that wouldn't happen. Now, there'd be other learning. I'm not saying that wouldn't be learning, wouldn't be practice. Of course, it would be practice, but it would be something. I think a little. If Zen is pragmatic, and as I see it, if Zen is nothing else, it is pragmatic. It is helping us to live our lives. Then that teaching of the variability of the letting go and holding on, the rhythm of our lives, and the grasping and the releasing and the desiring and the letting go. That's the core of absolute core of our practice. And I think sometimes people lose sight of that and think, oh, we should sit more. We should sit all the time. No, not in my view. In my view, we need to have a blend. But we need to make everything practice. It's the other thing. It's not, oh, we're going to just cruise for a couple of hours and then we get back on the cushion. So in this retreat, Susan, has the schedule gone out yet? Yeah, so see in the schedule. In this retreat, there's an hour, somewhere late in the afternoon, latish afternoon, for something that's called walk or art practice. Well, there's a few reasons that's there. Number one, if you've been in a retreat and you've been up early and you've been sitting and working and doing this all day long, by late afternoon, your senses are dulled. And while your butt might be on the cushion, typically your mind is someplace else or you're fighting sleep. It's not a, which is another kind of issue, is because like just being on the cushion isn't the issue. Being on the cushion in an awake and productive way is the issue. And late afternoon in a retreat, very often that becomes a struggle. What we used to do with the Baragados when we had retreats up in Orono is we went for a walk at that time of day. Now, that word walk is deceptive because we're not going out for a stroll. When we're going for a walk, it's a walk in the sense, Thich Nhat Hanh did a lot to elevate walking as a practice, as being silent and being aware and being fully engaged in the process of the walk. So that in many ways, the walk was identical to what was going on the cushion, except that the person is up and mobile, very in contrast to just sitting. Which is also something I've reflected on over the years. Because even when we're sitting intensely, we're interspersing it with walking. Kinhin, walking meditation. Walking meditation is an important part of Zen. And I see it as that is the transition between sitting on the cushion, where we have a minimum of distractions, and it's easiest to focus on our whatever our practice is, our koan, our breath, or whatever, and our lives, where it's often almost impossible. So in walking, we now are introducing some distraction, but it's also silent, it's also structured. And so it's a kind of a transitional step between the intense opportunity to concentrate on the cushion and the chaos that we often experience in much of our lives. I see it as very important. Thich Nhat Hanh saw it as very important. But he's in disrepute among many American Zen teachers. Another subject. Now, I want to talk, I want to segue from that to something else that I've been thinking about and came up in Tyson with somebody today. Um, and the predicate is this: when Zen practice evolved, the typical course of someone's involvement with Zen, not everybody, obviously, there were exceptions, but was that someone as a teenager, and when I say someone, 90% of the time a male someone, left home, entered a monastic setting, and devoted their entire life to practice. And the teaching was, the wisdom was that you will that practice, and reaching enlightenment is the ultimate goal. And those principally young people would devote themselves wholeheartedly for often decades, actually, rarely much less than decades, to have a deep realization, a deep enlightenment experience. Which was just the beginning. And then they went on and they continued practice, continued refining, and so on and so forth. Now, that is not a description of any of you or any of your lives. So I come back to the tension between we have a practice that to a great extent was developed for young men in monasteries. And again, there were some women practicing in those times, but very few, if we're being honest. To our practice today, where as I look about, I don't see any teenagers. And every one of us is living a complex life in society, in the world. And we're dealing with lots of things, right? And we're dealing with lots of complexities. And so that makes me think about the nature of our practice, and how does it need to change to accommodate to our reality in these times, in this country, and so on and so forth, as opposed to the reality in Tang Dynasty China or any of the other major historical periods of Chan, Zen, so on. Even into the 20th century. We're in a world today, those of us that lived in some of that 20th century know that this is already a radically different time from that. And that's only like 50 years ago, right? Radically different. So having a practice, now, see, now that I'm not a Zen teacher anymore, I can say these things with impunity. Having a practice that's predicated on get enlightened and then we'll live our lives is completely irrelevant. You're living your life right now, whatever degree of realization you have, and it's wonderful, and it will undoubtedly grow. But the chances are that none of us in this lifetime, maybe in another lifetime, but in this lifetime is going to reach a state of deep, perfect enlightenment. Even those youngsters like John Scott and Jim, who might have the time, are not living in a cloistered environment where they're devoting themselves 24/7 to practice, right? Lives, families, jobs, responsibilities, on and on and on and on. So more and more, I think we've got to think about Zen as something pragmatic that works in our lives today, as opposed to something It's almost like, it's almost like one of the things that many of us find irrelevant about the Judeo-Christian religions is that they talk about the next life, right? And what we're doing here now is like we're just preparing for the next life. We're trying to earn some merit, so we go to a good place, not a bad place, blah blah blah. No, Zen is about living this life. And if I'm talking about when you're enlightened, and I'm not saying you may never have Kensho, I'm not saying that at all. But if that's the sole guidepost, then I think we're missing everything in between. And I think most of us will go to our graves not having derived the maximum benefit from we can from this practice if we're focused there and not here. And this may all sound somewhat heretical. In a certain sense, it is, but the world is changing, and Zen practice must change with it, or it will become completely irrelevant. It's struggling for relevance right now. Those of you that go around and visit other sanghas online or in person may have discovered that none of them is overflowing with thousands of students and people banging down the doors. Let me in, let me have Zen. No, we're out on the periphery at best. And yet we have something, right? We have the light of the Dharma. The light of the Dharma changes our lives right here and now. So that's this paradox. Are we looking for something beyond, beyond, beyond? Or are we looking to illumine our life right here and now? To live better right here and now? To help this world right here and now? That's the capacity that we all have. Okay, which was a long way around the barn to my wanting to talk about dreaming. And Susan and I had a little conversation about this morning in our Daisan, and so Susan, if at some point you want to chime in, feel free. So I got on interested on this subject because I was reading about the Aboriginal people in Australia and what they call dreaming, the dreaming. And as much as I've read about it and tried to understand it, see that's the catchphrase right there. Try to understand. You can't understand it, right? It's not. It's like the Dharma. You can't understand it. You got to live it, and they live it in a way that I can't live it because I'm a white guy in the U.S. I'm not an Aboriginal person in Australia that's been raised in that culture, and so my psyche has been shaped by completely different things. But what made sense to me out of that I can kind of wrap myself around is, and I think kind of floats back towards a Zen perspective, is we are constantly creating our own reality. We are seldom looking through a completely transparent lens. Although that's what Zen is kind of pointed towards, right? That we're not filtering reality through the lens that lives up here between our ears, but that we're able to deal directly with the world as it is. And sometimes we can do that, and often we can't. And now, that was hard enough 30 years ago. But now we have these powerful and pervasive forces that are designed and intended to control our perception of reality. And I'm referring to media in many of its forms. And we're all exposed to media to greater or lesser extent. and culture and society, and we're all exposed to that to a greater or lesser extent. And that is a lens that shapes our view of reality, our perspective on reality. That is our dream, our dreaming. And I think that's actually consistent with it, with a Zen kind of perspective that's saying, that we're kind of that lens is the sum of our delusions, the sum of the things that obscure us for seeing things just as they are. Now we have some first step is to become aware of that. And I personally, I've made it a sort of part of my daily routine to try to be aware, like, what dream am I in? What's controlling my psyche? What's controlling my emotions? What's controlling my actions? And there's some days that I realize, oh my God, I'm in Donald Trump's dreaming state. I'm feeling anger. I'm feeling hatred. I'm feeling fear. I'm feeling divisiveness. I'm feeling disconnection. Is that the dream I want to be in? Is that the dream I want to live? And I call it Donald Trump's, but it's pervasive. There's people on the left who have that same dream. They just kind of change the adjectives or whatever, you know? And I don't want to be there. I want to be in a dream of connection. I want to be in a dream of compassion. I want to be in a dream of love. I want to be in a dream that I share with all the natural beings that surround me. And so this is kind of the not very Zen portion of this, that I feel like each day, and maybe many times a day, I have to make a deliberate, intentional shift of where my imaginal awareness is living. And am I in the dream I want to be in? Am I in the life I want to live? Am I in the world I want to create, not the world that's being created for me by various pernicious forces? I had this conversation last week with my acupuncturist, who's, I talk about him from time to time. He's a very bright guy, and he's kind of, well, he's affected by his thinking by Taoism, by five element acupuncture, and also kind of by, he's kind of Jungian in many respects, so he relates to this whole idea of dreaming. And he said he sees it with his patients. If they're coming in seeking to heal, but their imagination remains in the space of their pain or their illness or whatever, they don't heal. And they come back and say, well, I'm doing this, and this, but I don't feel better. Well, and to some extent, it's because their imagination, their dreaming, their, we could call it intention, we could give it many ways, is locked in a place of the illness, not in the place of the health. And in thinking about all of this, I think about the statement that Gandhi made about being the world that we want to see, right? It's been repeated so much that it's become trite in some ways, but I think it's more profound than I ever realized, because I think Gandhi was looking at that, and not just at literally what we do, but how we think, we feel, we imagine. and that those things should be aligned with the world that we want to live in and that we want to create. And that, so part of our work is having the awareness of where is that. If I scroll on my newsfeed, I know where I'm going to be, and it's not the place I want to be. Now that said, it's not simple, right? Because there's part of me that says, well, I want to know what's going on in the world. And even though there's in one way it's totally superfluous to my life, I feel like it's important to be aware. And yet I have to watch that line. When does that begin to dominate my awareness so that I'm being pulled in that direction versus living my life in the direction that I want to go? So all that, I'm going to shut up in a second here. I mean, all that is not very Zen in a classical sense of what Zen should be about. But I think it's important in terms of how we're living our lives in these days and how we're functioning as human beings. Thank you.
Mm. Thank you, Peter. Um, yes, Peter and I did have an interesting conversation about this morning. We were both kind of thinking about the same things, and um, coincidentally, I had, if there is such a thing, I had also been listening to Krista Tippett interview of the poet Vietnamese Ocean Vuong. Um, he's an interesting person. Of course, his practice is poetry. And being from Vietnam, he also has some cultural uh, proclivities from the East, so a little different tradition. And so he's speaking mostly about language, but it definitely dovetails with what Peter is saying. He talked first about the Eastern tradition of taking off one's shoes when you go to someone else's home. And he said that's not just, to keep the floor clean. That is a statement that someone is making that when I take my shoes off, this is entering a different space than I've been. And I intend to be thoughtful and quiet and respectful in that space. Um, and and then he said, um, I think that we need to take the shoes off of our voice when we speak with others, that rather than coming through harshly, uh, be aware that this is an intimate opportunity to connect with someone. And he said, words work within us, and we can divide people or we can build walls. And we can use words to destroy someone's feelings, or we can use words to boost them to a wonderful, wonderful state. And we are the participants in that that language. Uh, and he says you have to articulate the world you want to live in, which I think is like the dream. Uh, and he talked about some of our language and that some of our metaphors are very either competitive or violent. Uh, I knocked it out of the park. I owned it. We killed it. Oh, he's dead. And he said, if we think about our language, uh, where will we grow towards? Uh, and that our as humans, we are hardwired for revenge, and we're hardwired for forgiveness. We're hardwired for violence as well as compassion. And the difference is in the conditions that we create. So we can create conditions which lead us in one direction or another. Our culture creates revenge, violence, and if we want forgiveness, we have to create the conditions. Um, and we do that with intentional language. And I thought about a couple of things recently that changed my perception, my thoughts. One of them was the wife of, oh, I can't think of his name, the guy who was recently shot.
Charlie Kirk.
Charlie Kirk, thank you. His wife forgave his shooter. And then just shortly after that, there was the shooting of in a church, a Mormon church. And I read about there's a group of I think women who are banding together to create a culture of forgiving the person who killed people in their community and setting up a GoFundMe for the family of the person who did the shooting because they're left with so many expenses and this, that, and the other. And when I thought about those two events, I thought how each of them kind of gave me hope when I heard that forgiveness. It shifted me to, oh, well, maybe this is opening up opportunities for others to exist. Um, which is kind of like what Kathy talked about. They were just people walking, but it was so wonderful because of the conditions that people created for themselves in that walking. Um, so I present that to you. It was a beautiful talk, and talk is something that we all do every day, and seldom do I think about the deep impact that my words may have on someone else. Uh, but that helps them create their dream, I think. It's a little part of their dream. So those are some of my thoughts and
Thank you.
responses.
You mentioned that forgiveness versus revenge. One of the things that I do more often than I like is I scroll through Netflix or whatever looking for a movie. And it's amazing how many movies right now are about revenge. His whole family was killed and then he got even. The whole platoon was destroyed and she got even, and that is a powerful, prominent narrative in our culture right now. And it's so destructive. That idea, we've got to get revenge.
I went to a movie a little while ago and I was watching the coming attractions. And as I was watching them, I thought, oh, well, I think I understand why young men are going around shooting people indiscriminately. It was all over the movies, all over these coming attractions. It's hard to escape.
The video games, violent, hyper realistic video games that particularly young men are attracted to. Um, yeah, some young women also, but kind of a big male bias there.
And how do we attract enough attention in a different route, in a different way towards forgiveness, rather than just be appalled by the revenge?
Well, it's a good question. I think it's the question. You know, a lot of this goes. I read a good, very good book maybe about 2 years ago now called Dopamine Nation, and it was written by a woman and a psychiatrist out who was out in California. I forget her name right now, but that points to the degree to which people in this culture are dopamine addicted to dopamine rushes and how many things are, like all the video games, for example, all the violent movies, all of, but even down to so advertising has learned this, advertising has learned that we're addicted to the dopamine spikes. So it does things that's designed to create and foster that to sell things. So, you know, taking it down to that level, it's powerful and it's tough to counter. Because not only people are addicted to the dopamine, but they have no idea that they are. If you're putting heroin in your arm, you're addicted. you know. But if you're just all day long immersing yourselves in violent scenarios, angry scenario, that's that we joke about it at our great expense, but that's that often elderly white man who's watching Fox News in rage. We say he's addicted to rage. He's addicted to the dopamine that accompanies that rage. So it's at every level of our society. I think, and I'm getting a little afield here, but I think it's relevant. Speaking of old white men, so obviously the world right now is being controlled by some very destructive old white men, and who are sustaining this rage, who are sustaining it. And I believe that part of that is because if they ever came down long enough, they'd have to deal with their own mortality. But as long as you can live in that dopamine fueled environment, you don't have to take responsibility. You don't have to take account. You don't have to look at the fact. Look at these guys. They're in their 80s. They have no comprehension of their own mortality. What did I just see? Donald Trump wants to run in 2028. Donald Trump isn't going to be able to walk in 2028. He's going to be pushing up daisies by 2028 by, but that said, that so there's this it's just crazy, but it gets into a whole denial of death and a perpetual using dopamine as a drug to avoid reality.